Well, we're back again.
I know. Good morning, good afternoon,
Good evening.
good evening.
Whenever you're doing this.
Yeah.
So, as we prepare today to look at Genesis 41, Pam, why don't you open us up in prayer?
Okay. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you now and we just ask that you guide us as we look through the scripture to know something maybe we haven't seen before or haven't thought about, and just a revelation from you, dear Lord. I ask that you be with Jeff as he leads us, and just thank you for the blessings we have. We lift up the many struggles that are in our world today, and we lift those up to you and know that you are our God and you're in control. Thank you for being our Savior and Lord. Be with us now as we study. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.
Amen. So, when we talk about dreams, what comes to mind?
Well, sometimes I think the first thing when you say about dreams, I think about nighttime dreams. You know, things that you've woke up and either been excited about or not being excited about.
Okay.
You know,
Right.
So dreams that way. And then maybe dreams for future plans.
Okay.
That's a dream.
I'm not a dream for you.
You are my dream boat.
I have to milk it while I can. All right. Well, we've all had dreams, right?
Right.
We've all had dreams. And so, like you said, some dreams are good dreams. Some dreams come true. Some dreams don't come true. Some dreams come partially true. But as we focus today, we're going to be looking at the dream or dreams of Pharaoh. And so we're going to be looking at Genesis 41. And last week we left Joseph where?
In prison.
So he was in prison.
He had told the cupbearer and the baker about their dreams and had given the cupbearer information to please remember him whenever he got out.
Okay, all right. So let's look at Genesis 41, and let's look at verses 1 through 8. You want to read those?
Sure. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly thin cows ate up the 7 attractive plump cows, and Pharaoh awoke. And he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called all the magicians of Egypt and all his wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh.
So we began looking at this so familiar story. I mean, for some of us, if you grew up in church, we've heard these stories of Joseph. If you didn't, God bless you, because you're going to have the opportunity to have a foundation. Sometimes our memory of these stories kind of cloud and...
Well, and each one's fresh. Even though you've heard it before, you might get something new out of
Yeah,
it this time.
yeah, I was going a different way, but I'm going to leave that alone, okay? So anyway, we look at this text, and it starts out after 2 whole years, right? So that has to be attached to what's before it, or what's behind it. And so we find out that it would stand to reason that 2 years after the cupbearer gets out of prison, then Pharaoh begins having dreams. He begins having dreams. And, quite simply, the dreams are, the first dream is that 7 attractive cows are eaten by 7 ugly cows. But not only attractive, they were attractive and plump, and they were those kind of cows. And the ones that came along and ate them are the ugly and thin cows, right? So parallel there is, it's hard for me to understand even the thought of that, and that's why it's a dream. That's why God used it as a dream, right? And then he wakes up, it says, and then he falls back to sleep, and he has a second dream, and this dream didn't have to do with cows; it has to do with stalks of grain or ears of grain. It says that there were 7 ears of grain, good, plump. There again, ears of grain on one stalk, and then 7 more sprouted, but they were thin and blightful, and they swallowed the others. What do you think about that? I mean, we know what the interpretation of the dream is going to be, okay?
Right.
But think about that imagery for just a second. The 7 good versus the 7 attractive versus the 7 others, the 7 good stalks of grain versus the 7 thin. You see that. Of course, we know what that means, and we're going to look at it a little bit more. But just that imagery that Pharaoh, this great world power, the most powerful man in the world at that time, is having this dream. So, what did Pharaoh do with that dream?
Well, it disturbed him when he woke up.
Okay. So verse 8 says his spirit was troubled.
Mm-hmm.
His spirit was troubled. And maybe his spirit was troubled because he didn't understand. I guess it was that he didn't understand the dream. But, how do you take that dream? I mean, there's cows and grain. What specifically are we talking about there? And so what does he do? Verse 8.
He calls all of his magicians and the wise men of his concern, and they all come, but they can't interpret the dream.
Yeah. I thought about this yesterday. I kind of go forward to the Moses account and the plagues, because that Pharaoh called his magicians to make sense out of that. So these are kind of bookend stories. The first part of the Egyptian story and the end of the story have to do with Pharaoh and trying to get an understanding from some other source outside of God, right? So we see that, and it says clearly there at the end of verse 8 that none were there to be able to interpret the dream, right? And that was troubling to Pharaoh. I mean, that in his spirit, I don't understand the dream, so I call on these folks who are the professionals, and I don't know if you've waited for some kind of interpretation of a medical problem or a building problem, those kind of things, and you're waiting on somebody else, and they look at you and they say, I don't know, and then how does that feel? So I think that's somewhat of what Pharaoh's feeling here in this text. So then we look down at these verses of 9 through 13. It says, then the cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offense today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in the custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard, and when we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged. Now, if you weren't with us last week, you can get back online and see chapter 40. But that's the prison dreams of these 2 men, and so the cupbearer, after 2 years, when Pharaoh has this dream and no one else can answer it, the cupbearer, who's gotten back into the good graces of Pharaoh, comes around and he says, today I remember what I was supposed to do. What's he talking about there? Well, if we go back and we look at Genesis 40 in verse 17, Joseph is giving this cupbearer his interpretation of the dream, and after he does give him that, he says in verse 17, he says, no, that's not 17. It's 14. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do this kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. And so Joseph's asking the cupbearer, said, "This is going to happen to you, God." And the cupbearer's responsibility, I guess, what Joseph wanted his responsibility to be was to what?
To remember him.
Yeah.
Get him out of there.
Yeah.
If he told, maybe he would get released.
I find it quite interesting here. I didn't mention, I didn't really pick up on this until yesterday, but you read something, you miss a little phrase, but we're thinking, here's Joseph, he's asked the cupbearer to remember him, but there's a little bit something there that I missed, is that he wanted him to mention it to Pharaoh, because he was in the king's prison, and 2 years is gone. The cupbearer's been able to go back and set up house or whatever that kind of thing is. So the first thing that the cupbearer did not remember was he didn't remember when he got out to tell Pharaoh of the dream.
And I think that's to remember that too, that Pharaoh didn't put Joseph in prison at this point.
No.
Pharaoh didn't know him.
No.
So that was another reason I think he wanted, or God wanted, him to mention him to Pharaoh, because Pharaoh didn't know who Joseph was at this point.
That's right. Yeah. So the second thing that the cupbearer, it's evident that the cupbearer didn't remember, was in verse 8 of chapter 40. Joseph is explaining to the cupbearer and the baker, but he's talking to the cupbearer right now. He says that he's had this dream. Joseph's talking to him, and Joseph shares with him, "Do not interpretations belong to God?" And so the cupbearer is told by Joseph before that interpretation of his dream back in prison that God does that. So these are the two things when he says, "What are my offenses?" His offenses were, he didn't say anything 2 years later about God giving the interpretation. Who did he give credit for the interpretation?
The Hebrew boy.
Yeah. I do think that's God's plan. I do think that's God's plan. So we see that, and so this kind of adds to the story that we will see. So let's look at verses 14 and 15. Pam, you want to read that?
Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it."
Yeah, so here's Pharaoh and his desire to get the interpretation of this dream, to understand what this dream means. He doesn't have anyone in his circle. All of his wise guys,
don't know.
Yeah. So his wise guys don't know. So he's desiring to know, because his spirit's troubled. I mean, his internal mechanism is just really unsure about what this dream means, because it's not one of those passing thoughts that I can't remember, at the breakfast table. This is something that is weighing heavy on him. And so Pharaoh, does something that's quite unusual to get the meaning of this dream. He finds a person in an unusual place, prison, and an unusual person, a Hebrew, and he brings them out of there. And then we see that Joseph makes this transition. He shaves and cleans himself up. He gets prepared to see the king. As I said yesterday, I do my noon Bible study online live. If you want to be part of that, just email me. I'll put you in that group. But we talked about that a little bit yesterday. I think about the Wizard of Oz, how they all had to be cleaned up to go see the wizard, and I kind of see that in this text. In my mind, that's just how simple my mind works. But here we go, Joseph being cleaned up to be presented to Pharaoh because Pharaoh's looking for an answer. And then we see verse 16. I believe without a doubt that verse 16 is the hinge of this whole text. In fact, I think 16 is the hinge even of our lives, but nonetheless, look at verse 16. And Joseph answered, Pharaoh's asking him a question. I have this dream. I'm looking for somebody to interpret it. I hear you can. And then verse 16 comes along. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not in me. Here's the world power. I mean, he's been asked to go to the White House and stand before the president. Doesn't matter the politics. That's a powerful place, right? Mm-hmm. And he's been brought to give an interpretation. And what does he say? It's not in me.
You got to finish the sentence.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. It says it's not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And so he is looking at the king of the most powerful nation and saying, I can't give you that interpretation, but God will. God will tell you what that means. What's that say about Joseph's relationship to God?
That he's been trusting and been faithful to God throughout his whole ordeal. He was always back in the prison. He was giving God credit, and then now he's giving God credit again.
Yeah. So Joseph's devotion for God and his trust in God led him to a place to know that God's going to give this interpretation. I mean, and when you think about that, isn't that remarkable? I mean, you think about the backstory of Joseph. I mean, here he was, had the birthright of the family. Right. His brothers grab him and throw him in a pit. Mm-hmm. They sell him as a slave. Mm-hmm. He works in Potiphar's house. What happens there? He
gets put in prison.
Why?
Because the wife tells a story on him.
False accusation. Mm-hmm. He gets thrown into prison. He tells these guys the meaning of their dream, and
they forget.
I mean, situationally, when we have that many things hitting us, what does that do to our relationship with the Lord? What can that do with our relationship?
It can distance it or even just disconnect it altogether.
Yeah.
It depends on how you look at it.
Yeah. So we see this text, and Joseph right up front tells him, he says, the Lord's going to give you, God's going to give you the understanding. In fact, he goes on to say, and it just kind of speaks to me this morning, that God's going to give you a favorable. Mm-hmm. You see, he was walking with the Lord so much that God had already calmed his spirit to say, this is going to be a favorable dream, right? And so then we see these verses, 17 through 24, and what we see in those verses is, once again, we hear the dream again. We hear about the 7 cows, the 7 beautiful cows, the 7 ugly cows, the 7 plump grain, the 7 thin grain, and what's going to happen there. And he says, and Pharaoh says, and no one in my leadership, no one that I know can tell me what this means, but I'm still troubled. So let's look at Joseph's response to the dream in verses 25 through 32. You want to read that? Mm-hmm.
Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land.
So, go and get 32.
And the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the things that are is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring about them. Let me read that again.
Yeah.
And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about.
So this is Joseph's response to Pharaoh's telling him about the dream. And we see a lot here, but the three things that I want to point out is here's Joseph. He's going back to his original statement. It's not in me, but God will bring a favorable report. And he says to Pharaoh, the dream that Pharaoh had are one. So he's first telling him that both dreams
are about the same thing.
Yeah, he's just telling him that, and he's telling him that he's doing that because of these three things. The first thing is Joseph is reminding Pharaoh who gives the dream and the meaning. Who gives the dream and the meaning? Why is that important to this story?
Because it's giving God the glory for it. And as we know how the story unfolds, this is God's plan, and it's just every piece is falling in.
Yeah. So he reminds Pharaoh of who's giving him the dream and who's going to give him the meaning. But he also, in verse 28, he uses God again, and he shows that God is about to do this. What is God about to do? What is God going to do in this dream? What's the overview of this dream?
And he's going to keep his promise to Abraham.
Yeah. I probably shouldn't have said overview because that is. But the seven years that are coming are going to be good years.
And then the famine.
And then the famine's going to come, right?
Right.
And so he's just telling him that this is coming, okay? Make preparation. But God is giving Pharaoh with this dream a glimpse into the future, right? And then the third thing that we see in this text is that verse 32 is so big because the mission of God is fixed. Okay? The mission of this dream is fixed, and the bigger mission of God, the one you were going for that we'll talk about in just a second. But the mission of God in the dream was God is fixed, and this is going to begin really quickly. It's going to happen soon, it says. And so here is Joseph telling this leader about this dream, and then he says, and it's going to happen soon. You're going to have 7 good years. You're going to have 7 bad years, and so you got to get ready, right?
Right.
And so Joseph gives him the meaning of the dream, and then Joseph continues to respond, right? So let's look at 33 through 40. See if I can get my eyes focused.
Right. And now, therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. The food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to concur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine.
Go ahead. Let's go on down to 40.
Okay. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this in whom the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." So
we see in this text that not only did Joseph tell him the meaning of the dream, but Joseph also, and that came from God, but Joseph went ahead and shared with him the process that must happen to provide, right?
Right. The solution to the problem.
Where do you think Joseph got that?
God.
Joseph was a smart man, wasn't he? He was kind of like your husband. He was an intelligent.
Right. With God.
With God, yeah. So Joseph understood the interpretation came from God, and we see here, because you got to keep in mind, I mean, I think this just blows me away. Here's a man that woke up that morning in a prison cell. And now he's sitting in a palace. He went from the prison to the palace. I mean, went from the low of lows to, and I mean, he was even a servant in the prison, you know? So he went from the lows to the highs. And so he wouldn't have had time to read big processes and all those kind of things. So he was divinely inspired, right?
Right.
And so Joseph delivers this process to Pharaoh about the mission that God has, right? And so what does he say? He says that what we're going to do is we're going to take a fifth of the produce of the land and we're going to store it up during those good years. And then, you know, we're going to keep that. And then when we need it, we'll dispense it out, right? We're going to talk about that next week. We're going to talk about how the brothers come back next week. So we'll pick up here in the latter part of chapter 41. But today we see this as Joseph has delivered this process. And then he says to him, Joseph says to him, you know, you gotta have a group. Where is that? I can't see. They gathered and under the authority for the food. That food will be in reserve. So he says that, oh, there it is in verse 33. Let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. You know, I think that has to come from the Lord. I don't think he was saying, okay, I gave you the dream, here's my resume. I don't think it went like that. I think that was part of the plan. I don't know that, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to speak. I don't want to speak my poor earthly wisdom into that. But anyway, nonetheless, he gives him the plan. He talks about the plan, needing somebody to supervise the plan, all of that kind of thing. And what we see is in verse 37, the proposal pleased Pharaoh and his servants. I mean, in my mind, I see Pharaoh sitting in the Pharaoh chair and all of his flunkies sitting around him, you know, or if we say it like we do in America, watch how I say this, but, you know, you get the president and the cabinet. So you've got the large leadership of the country there. Can't you see Pharaoh sitting in that chair and he hears this and he goes, I got to find somebody with a wise and discerning spirit that can do that. And Pharaoh's looking around at all those men.
You can't find one.
And there's not one there. And so there again, God has shown him something. He showed the problem. And Pharaoh's saying, well, where do we find a man like that? Look what he says. He says, can we find a man like this in whom the Spirit of God is on? And Pharaoh even recognizes the Spirit of God. Why wouldn't he recognize the Spirit of God? Now, I'm not saying Pharaoh was a follower of God. I'm just saying he recognized God. And he would have recognized God because he's just been given this. I mean, Joseph's the only man that was answering his questions, okay? And so Pharaoh thinks about it. He says, we got to have somebody that possesses wisdom, and we got to have somebody that has discernment, and have somebody that has the Spirit of God on. We got in a conversation yesterday about what this wisdom and discernment was, and I kind of just left it where it was, and so when I got finished, one of the folks that's in our Bible study sent me a text, and this was their understanding of it says discernment reveals truth, wisdom knows how to apply truth. I like that. So discernment reveals truth. This isn't mine. Discernment reveals truth, and wisdom knows how to apply truth. And I think that's something that we have to think about. This is what Pharaoh's looking for. So we come to this place, and here's Pharaoh looking at all of his folks, and he's saying, who possesses this wisdom? Who's got this discernment? Who has this who has the discerning spirit? Who has the wisdom? And the one that had just done these things is standing there. And if it was in Kentucky and this story happened, Joseph would be standing there and Pharaoh would be looking at him, and Pharaoh would say, you the man. You the man. So, this kind of sums up where we're going today. How can a man go from an Egyptian prison to the second in command of Egypt?
God's plan.
So God understood who God, or Joseph, who God understands. So Joseph understands who God is, and that has to be huge, right? Because for Joseph to be used as part of God's promise, God had a dream for Joseph. And that dream or plan, God has this plan for Joseph. And Pharaoh's dream had been given by God as a preview of how God was going to keep his promise. Of course, I think sometimes that Pharaoh may have thought, man, I've got this dream. This is to save my people, right?
Right.
And it did save Egypt. But that wasn't God's plan. That wasn't the big plan, right? I mean, the big plan was God was still orchestrating that promise he made all the way back to Abraham. That your people will be abundant, you'll be a father of many nations, that I'm going to bless you in the land. And so God has orchestrated moving Joseph from this young 17-year-old boy who'd been given the birthright to a slave, to a prisoner, and now back into a house to be used. God's dream for him was unexpected, and God's dream for us, God's plan for us, is unexpected too, right? So as we look at that, does God have a plan for you or a dream for you? I think he does. I think he does for all of us. So when we think of that, what's the first question that comes to mind?
What is it?
So let's talk about that real quickly. I will say this, quite honestly. If you'll email me, I've got a handout that I'd be glad to shoot out to you. If you ask and request for the handout, just ask for the request of the handout of how do I know God's dream connected to Genesis 41, okay? So let's talk about that for just a second. How do we know God's dream for us? How do we know God's plan for us? And as we think about Joseph, the first thing is we've got to allow God room in every situation of our life. We've got to allow him room in every situation of our life. And we must trust God. Right? So Joseph never let those outside situations take him away from trusting God. I mean, he trusted God throughout that whole plan, all right? And so over the weeks, over the months, I've been reflecting on why we need power verses, those verses that we can cling to that will give us strength in difficult times, or maybe you're talking with someone. And so I've built into this form about 3 power verses that's going to go along with these points. But I'm just going to read one. I've got 3, couple Psalms, but Proverb 3, 5 through 6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your path. Whenever we get into those outside situations that clamor at us to move our trust from God to place it somewhere else, we need some sort of verse, we need some sort of handle to move us back. And I think that's one. The second thing I think Joseph did is not only trust God and kept his trust in God, but we see this trust of God, but we also see this deep love of who he is. Pam and I just the other day had a 15-20 minute conversation about a word that would go here, and she came up with the best word, and her word was, we must be devoted to God. And to be devoted to God in either in good times and the bad times, right? Right? You want to speak to that?
Yeah, just that no matter the situation, it's easy when everything's running good. It's not as easy when it's going downhill or bad, but we should be the same. We should be constantly devoted. So
we can grow in that devotion by setting aside time. I mean, I don't want you to think this is about behavior modification, because I don't want to get into that. It's not that. But I think out of our love for God and out of our desire for God, that our in engaging in God's word and prayer and those kind of things kind of fill our tank, right?
Sure.
I've often thought that in a year, 366 days this year, right? Leap year. So there's a good day, there's the best day and the worst day, and all the rest of them fit somewhere in between that, you know. But even in the worst day, when we need to show God devotion the most, we need to just stop and do that because it fills our tank. And you know, I feel like Joseph wasn't fickle in his devotion for the Lord. I feel like he showed it, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've got three. I got a couple of Psalm and then Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to His purpose. And the reason we say that is even in the midst of a storm, if I hold on to that verse, you know, the good I'm looking for may not be the good that comes out of it. But God takes it and uses it for good, right? You know, the good for Joseph getting thrown into a prison. I mean, he wanted out. He wanted the baker to mention it to Pharaoh and get out like the next day, right?
Cup holder. Not the baker.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, he didn't want to go where the baker
the
was.
Baker
Yeah, thank you.
Much.
Thank you, Pam.
Sure.
Keeping me on task. So we must trust God. We must be devoted to Him. And I think part of the devotion is we're listening to Him. That we'll put ourselves in a position to hear from His Word, prayer, situations, the church, all those kind of things that come into play. And then I think the third thing, the final thing is that as with our trust and deepening our love is that we come to a place of showing obedience, right? That as we do that, our obedience comes to the place where our life choices, the ability to obey God and take Him at His word. The situations aren't easier, but it's easier to obey God. And I relate that to like a muscle. That if our obedience muscle, if we're working on our obedience muscle, then it gets stronger and it holds us up in those times. So if we trust God and we're devoted to Him and focused on Him and inputting into Him, then all of that reverts into us in a place where obedience is seen. And we're going to hear from God. We're going to know what His plan is. He's going to direct us. I really like 1 Peter 1:13-15. Therefore prepare your minds for action and be sober-minded. Set your hope full on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as He who called you is holy, you also be holy in your conduct. So there you go. Whew. Good words we have to grow into, right? All right. So there we go. If you'd like a copy of that, email me. I'll be glad to send it back to you. Like I say, I'd be glad to do that. So anyway, hey, be praying for us as a church as we figure out what the next weeks and the summer looks like. We're still talking through that. We've got all kinds of questions, right? We have no answers. So I do know this. We'll see you again next week. I have decided and feel like because of many of you that we'll be putting Bible studies online from now on out. So be watching for some of that. So anyway, let me pray with you. Father, we thank you that your promise to Abraham was in such a place that you carried it out all the way through creation. God, your promise for Abraham's even working through us, that you brought Jesus to earth to die upon the cross to forgive us of our sins. And Father, you call us because you have a dream. Your mission is still alive and well, and that is to make you known. So God, I pray that we would come to a place that we would grow in our trust, our devotion, and our obedience to you. Lord, thank you for your word, and pray blessings over those that have listened to it today. Father, would you impact our heart by it? Lord, forgive us where we fail you in Jesus' name. Amen.